So this game begins with d3, and I go d5, knight c6, all standard. I want to attack c2, so I go knight b4 directly, and yeah, probably rook c1 was better, but my opponent goes e4, so I take, and I'm thinking 95, probably best move. But then 94 I can just capture, so the c2 pawn is still under attack. Yeah, I'm thinking maybe trade the knight and take on c3, or maybe start an attack on f2, or I decide to keep the bishop, and the idea is to go knight to d5 and try and hit f4 bishop. Yeah, f7 is under attack from the knight, and also c6, so my opponent goes knight c6, and I'm just looking back, maybe I could have taken on d4, the last move, but anyways, I am taking right now on c6, and I trade the c7 pawn for the b2 pawn. So yeah, I was expecting maybe my opponent goes bishop somewhere, but they play knight d6. I trade, and after bishop a5, I was expecting pawn at b5 to trade the bishops off and then go bishop d2, but this move allowed me to play knight f5 because I'm trying to knock the bishop from that diagonal. Bishop c5 here is interesting to prevent castles. Maybe I could play pawn d6 next after that move, but my opponent goes bishop c3, which I can trade. So I trade the bishop, and after the block, I was considering sacking the queen on a1, or maybe even taking on d2, but I settled for queen e5 so I can attack f2. So I'm also attacking d6, but the idea is to get bishop at b6 and bear down on the f2 pawn. So my opponent goes bishop f4, and I imagine the next move would be bishop e3, and I was ready to sack the queen here. So I play queen takes e3, and after the trade, I want to play take on f2 or pawn at d2, or maybe even bishop at c3, and then try and get some knight f4 or knight d4 moves. So my opponent goes bishop queen b7, and I've thought of sacking on f2 first before castling, but also I have bishop c3 as well. So I eventually settle for bishop c3, and then I castle immediately after. Because I wanted the king to walk up in the event of pawn takes e3, and I was comfortable with knight takes e3, and if king takes, I would go knight d5 and start an attack. So I'm taking knight d5. If king ever goes f2, then I can have maybe bishop e3, king f3, and then get some knight. Maybe yeah, knight e5 was better, but actually yeah, covering e2 is quite important. So now I see a way to get the queen with knight f2 check, and I pick up the queen, which effectively ends the game. In this Crazyhouse game, I am playing black and I go knight f6 against 1 d4 and try to get a quick setup with the two pawns on the sixth rank. So after e5, I wanted to recapture, but instead I tried to attack the bishop so I could get hold of the light squares, of the dark squares. So my opponent castles, and here I'm thinking something similar to knight f4 or bishop g6. But I didn't want to go bishop g6 immediately because I thought there wasn't any need for that yet. So I go knight f4 and now I go bishop g6 in response to knight g5. But now the bishop is under attack and I completely missed that I would have to take with the f pawn if I wanted to keep the bishop on and keep the h7 square covered. But in doing so, the e6 pawn would be hanging, and so yeah, this I expected knight f7, yeah, and everything has happened. So I took the f7 pawn, and initially I had misjudged the power of queen h5 because I was going to play bishop h6 back, but after queen h5, if bishop h6, I believe there is at least rook, bishop takes f7. So then I try to compensate for that by going queen f8. And yeah, I didn't quite understand why pawn at g6 was needed. So I guess my opponent had considered after bishop h5 I would go g6, and maybe they thought that was a reasonable reply. But after pawn at g6, I decided to go bishop at h6 so I can have maybe some attack on the f6, h6, g5, f4 diagonal later. And I really want to sack the queen on g2, but it doesn't really work because even after queen g2, king g2, knight f4, after white goes take, king takes h2, I don't have enough time to take on e2 because of the f7 square is very weak, and also there's immediate knight g6 that would lead to mate. So after many deliberations, I eventually sacked the queen on g2. And the only move is knight f4 still. By playing knight f4, at least I can cover g6, and I reinforce the protection over g6. So my opponent goes knight f7 and just takes on h6. Pretty standard. Maybe even queen g4 there. Immediately would win the knight. So yeah, I take twice. And I expected maybe rook takes h6 or queen takes or queen f3 check. So after queen f3 check, I wanted to block with the bishop, but I thought maybe they would sack the queen for the bishop or something crazy like that. So I play pawn f5 so I can get knight g4, and I just try to defend. But yeah, after knight g4, I assume they can just capture the knight actually, which happens. And now I am going to attempt to run with the king. Yeah, so there's probably a mate here for my opponent, but I eventually run to d7, and the only threat I have is to go knight f3. So after castles, I thought, okay, after taking the rook, I'm currently attacking the queen, which my opponent missed. So I think, yeah, after knight b5, I try to run still. And there must be a mate somewhere here, but my opponent just hasn't found it. And yeah, so I take on b4. There's rook b1. There's all sort of there's 94. Yeah, there's clearly some mating pattern that my opponent had missed. But at this point, it looks like the checks have run out, and maybe actually queen d8 would have been a good try by my opponent, because if I was to block, then queen takes c5 c7. But if I was to take on b5 after queen d8, king takes b5, there is at least bishop e3 or even queen bishop d3 or queen d3, which would be very dangerous. And there's also c4, but my opponent runs out of time because of the threat of knight f3 on their king.